Hello there. Today we're going to continue our long-running series, The Conquered and the Proud, which covers Roman history from around about 200 BC through to about 200 AD. So we're into the last century of this now, chronologically, and we've taken a little bit of a diversion the last couple of sessions when we looked at provincial government, first of all under the Republic, and we focused particularly on Cicero and his time in Cilicia, and then there's the talk on the imperial system, how the creation of the Principate by Augustus and the existence of one man with supreme power fundamentally changed the relationship between governors and provincials and central authority. And then we looked in some detail at Pliny and his time in Bithynia and Pontus under the Emperor Trajan. Today we're returning to the overall chronological story of the period, and we're going to look at the first two emperors of the 2nd century AD. We're going to be looking at the Emperor Trajan and then the Emperor Hadrian. So we're coming back into Pliny country in one respect. So we'll look at the story of their two reigns, a little bit at who they were, and then give some sense of how the system is changing. This will lead us on. From now on, we've got a couple more chronological talks to do, and then we'll be mostly various themes. So we've got a few things to look at different times from different approaches. But today we're back to a basic narrative, a basic story. Begins really with the murder of Domitian in AD 96. Now, if you go back to the lecture on the Flavians, which came out, several months ago now, we've covered this, how Vespasian wins the civil war that follows the death of Nero in 68. Vespasian's the last man left standing with an army behind him by 69, becomes emperor. He's succeeded by his older son Titus, a man with considerable military experience who served as legion commander under his father during the suppression of the Jewish rebellion. And then when Vespasian went off to contest for the throne, Titus is left in charge. He clearly is guided by senior, more experienced advisors and other officers, but nevertheless, he is very much the hero of Josephus' narrative of the Jewish war. Titus only lasts a few years before dying, perhaps naturally, perhaps not. We don't really know one way or the other. He's succeeded by his younger brother Domitian, who doesn't have military experience. Both Vespasian, who is reasonably popular during his lifetime, Titus perhaps more posthumously by contrast with his brother, and to some extent in the early years of Vespasian's reign he'd taken command of the Praetorian Guard. He'd been his father's enforcer to some extent, so wasn't always as popular as all that. Had also had the was considered to be scandalous by the aristocracy, this affair with Berenike, one of the Herods, an Eastern princess, Jewish as well, and seemed very much in love with her. I don't know why they killed her off in that rather strange, what was it called, Those About to Die, Amazon series, in slightly bizarre circumstances. Titus, certainly in the longer term memory, is remembered as one of the good emperors, and his reign does seem to be reasonably capable, but it isn't a particularly long one, it only lasts a few years. Domitian is remembered much less favourably by the senatorial tradition, and we have to remind ourselves that emperors are judged on the sources that survive about them. Those sources are overwhelmingly written by, or at least for, the elite, which is dominated by the Senate. So if you please the Senate, if you do things that you flatter them, you treat them with sufficient respect, you give senators important jobs, you rely on them for their advice, or at least appear to do so. Do it enough so that it can continue the facade Augustus created of this not being a monarchy, this not being a military dictatorship, but the idea that the princeps, the emperor, is simply the greatest servant of the state, primus inter pares, first among equals in the Senate, the most distinguished senator, but very much one of them. Now, that facade has weakened, almost crumbled in the years after Augustus. Augustus maintained that very well, and even then everybody knew it wasn't real, but they were willing to believe in it. It became harder and harder to believe in this under successive emperors, particularly the Caligulas, the Neros, even Tiberius absenting himself from Rome for so much of his reign, not appearing in the Senate, obviously, because he wasn't in Rome. Vespasian was the first emperor to have all his powers voted to him in one law, part of which survives. So that instead of this gradual accumulation of different rights, the tribunician potestas, the maius imperium proconsulare, other dignities of various sorts, he gets it in one fell swoop because he has no even remote claim by adoption, let alone blood, with the imperial family, the extended Julio-Claudian family. This is very new. Now, Vitellius, Otho, Galba to some extent fall into that category as well, but Vespasian it's even more so, and he's the one who's actually got to make it work. He lasts long enough that he's got to make his regime successful. So during this time he will flatter the Senate to a great degree. You have new patricians created to add to the dignity of individuals within the Senate, and you also have quite a lot of men who are brought in from provincial aristocracies. You're continuing that trend that's been there since Julius Caesar. Claudius obviously introduced a lot of Gauls to the Senate. This move towards making this an imperial aristocracy. But again, senators have to live in Italy, they have to own property in Italy, and they have to spend most of their time in or near Rome. They are only supposed to visit other parts of the empire with imperial permission, which they might get, but nevertheless it's under control. Domitian is deeply unpopular with the Senate. He is suspicious. He obviously has a difficult personality. He doesn't have the military record of his father and his brother, so he hasn't got anything to show for, I'm a good Roman aristocrat in the traditional way. I've done these things. I've won glory. He does appear to be rather a capable administrator, in that the empire, generally speaking, seems to work rather well. In fact, he is criticized for being too ready to listen to complaints by provincial communities about imperial governors who are senators and punish those senators. So again, this is something where what he might be doing might actually be the right thing, but it's not popular with the class that dominates our sources. He appoints a lot of equestrians to senior posts, and that causes resentment amongst the Senate, the feeling that, well, any plum job, any important job ought to go to a senator, somebody of proven dignity rather than some upstart of an equestrian. Famously, his Praetorian prefect, Cornelius Fuscus, is given an army command in one of the wars against Dacia and ends up getting killed and leading his army to disaster. So there's that sort of schadenfreude of the senatorial class that, oh well, if you will appoint some oik who is not really of our standing, what do you expect? On the other hand, there are defeats suffered by senatorial commanders at that time as well. So Domitian is eventually murdered, but not murdered by a senatorial conspiracy, it's by a palace conspiracy. Then something interesting happens, because what had gone on just briefly after the death of Augustus, when Tiberius was muddying the water and not making it clear that he did actually want to be emperor, rather more openly after the assassination of Caligula, where for several hours the Senate debates briefly whether they should be a republic, but after that, well, okay, we better have an emperor, let's choose one of our number, let's choose the man best suited to the job, the person who most deserves it. One of us can be in charge and run the empire. Something similar happens after Domitian's assassination, because there's no obvious heir, there's no one left in the imperial family, and they settle on a chap called Nerva, who is, by 96, he will die in 98, he's already an old man at this point. He is one of those senators who has managed to negotiate all the changes, all the successive emperors, the mad ones, the Neros, the Civil War period, the Flavians, and still been there with no one's got too much of a grudge against him. He's probably one of these fairly harmless old buffers who doesn't actually do very much, doesn't actually say very much, who's flattered the right people at the right time and then moved on to whoever's next important. He's not committed himself so firmly to anybody that he's considered to be too heavily tarred with the resentment left behind by unpopular emperors, including Domitian. So he is proclaimed as emperor. First thing he does pretty much is promise a very large bounty to the Praetorian Guard. Again, this is, even in normal succession this happens, but when you're coming under slightly shaky circumstances, then this tends to be even more important for you to make sure that the bodyguard, or the people who have particularly under, if their leaders don't like you, can have readiest access to you and can kill you more easily than anybody else, then clearly you want them on your side. He is forced by the Praetorians to punish the murderers of Domitian. So in spite of the fact that there is considerable public joy amongst the Senate in particular that Domitian is now dead, nevertheless, and they'd be happy about this, the Praetorians make sure that the conspirators are arrested and killed. Quite quickly, Nerva adopts Trajan, Marcus Ulpius Traianus, name in full, who is an army commander, who's a senator, who is in charge of an army on the Rhineland, so has troops at his disposal. Trajan is seen as a popular choice for the army. Now, we'll do more talks on the Roman army, and it's not entirely clear you can actually talk about the army's opinion on any particular thing. If you think back to the era of 4 emperors, the civil war after Nero's death, each provincial army pretty much goes its own way and decides who it will back as candidate for the throne. There isn't a sort of the soldier's choice that settles on one person. Trajan has a reasonable military record, but not an exceptional one. His main qualification is rather like Vespasian and the other men who come to the fore during the era of 4 emperors. He's got a provincial command with legions under his control at that time. He has been involved, he's been a loyal supporter of Domitian, he's done quite well with that. His father was a notable legion commander in Vespasian and then Titus's campaigns to suppress the Jewish rebellion. So he appears in Josephus' Jewish War on several occasions. He's given a very good write-up. He's one of the men who helped to back Vespasian to get to power and then confirmed him in power. So he's very much someone who's done well under the Flavians, and the son's career has been promoted. Trajan was loyal to Domitian. When there was a rebellion of one of the German provinces, Trajan, then commander of a legion in Spain, marches from Spain, takes his troops to help suppress the rebellion in person, and then is given a command by Domitian. So he is someone who is very heavily associated with the Flavians. So he may also be a political choice that means that this is not a complete break with the past. People who have done well under the previous dynasty will continue to do well. This is not a rejection. We're not going to throw you all out of office. You will still get good posts because we're still part of that. We've got rid of Domitian because he was just getting too neurotic, too suspicious, too murderous. He'd killed senators. He'd had senators executed. Again, part because he's had a rebellion by one senatorial provincial governor against him tends to make someone even more suspicious than they were in the first place. So Trajan is a compromise in a sense. The idea that he's this really experienced military commander is largely myth. He had extensive service as a military tribune, longer than was average, at least according to Pliny's rather groveling panegyric devoted to him. He had taken part in this limited civil war. It wasn't really a full civil war, and a coup that fails. He'd helped suppress that. There may have been some expedition beyond the Rhine against the Free German tribes, which had won him some victory, but it's not a major thing. He hadn't been, compared to his father, who has seen a fair bit of military service, Trajan has not. Trajan may have accompanied his father on whilst the father was governor in the east, in a confrontation with the Parthians that probably stopped short of war. Whether there was some fighting or not is hard to say. It was, again, typical of the diplomacy backed by force, tread softly but carry a big stick approach that you get in the relations between the Romans and Parthians in the imperial period, and on the whole works. So Trajan is no particular relationship to Nerva, but there's enough there. He's adopted a son. That's a major bond, as we've seen repeatedly looking throughout Roman history. It is considered to be as close as a son by blood. And that will set the pattern for most of the 2nd century, where emperors are succeeded not by an actual child, an actual son, but by someone they have adopted. So Nerva is succeeded by Trajan. He's adopted Trajan. Trajan will eventually possibly adopt Hadrian. We'll come to that in a moment. But it's considered, that at least is the official version, that he has been adopted, and that is why Hadrian succeeds him. Hadrian adopts a chap called Verus, who then dies before Hadrian does, and after that adopts Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius adopts Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, son of the man who died on Hadrian before he could succeed. All this pattern of adoption stops with Marcus Aurelius because Commodus happens to be around and has reached, well, he's late teens by the time that Marcus Aurelius dies, but he's ruled as co-emperor with his father for several years. So Marcus Aurelius is the one that breaks the trend of succession by adopted sons. And of course that doesn't go terribly well because Commodus, the blood relation, proves to be somewhat unlike his father in terms of abilities and diligence. But it is an interesting change within the Roman system, and there does seem to be a fairly significant reduction in attempted coups, attempted rebellions by provincial governors. There's certainly no successful usurpation for over a century until Marcus Aurelius has abandoned the system. Abandoned the system. Commodus, after 12 years, has alienated people so badly that he gets murdered. Pertinax lasts a few months. We'll come on to this in more detail eventually. And then you have the civil war between Septimius Severus, Clodius Albinus, and Pescennius Niger. But up until that point, it's almost as if the Senate's much more content when they come to believe that each new emperor is going to be one of their number. He will be somebody youngish, or at least youngish middle-aged, who will be adopted by the current emperor and groomed for power, but he's one of them. He is very much part of the Senate, a proper aristocrat, someone who can be expected to treat the Senate with respect. So that's the pattern that will dominate the 2nd century, the golden age of Edward Gibbon, the 5 good emperors from Nerva through to Marcus Aurelius, where in terms of prosperity, probably population until the Great Plague start to hit, the empire will reach its peak. And very many of the greatest monuments left by the Roman Empire come from this period. The paradox is that for all this success, for all this might, this is actually rather a difficult period to study, particularly in terms of the sort of narrative history, political history that we're trying to do today, because the sources are extremely poor. We do not have good detailed narrative histories for the 2nd century AD. Tacitus carried his account in the histories up until 96 and the death of Domitian. However, it only survives up until 70, and it breaks off before the suppression of the Batavian revolt. So we get a lot of that story, but we don't get all of it, and then it's gone. So we don't know about that. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, began his work when Trajan stopped. When Tacitus stopped, began in 96. But again, none of that survives, none of the earlier stuff. And given the level of detail in his later books on the 4th century, he must have skimmed over a lot of the earlier stuff pretty briskly. Cassius Dio did write a fairly detailed history of the entire period, but in the main, this only survives in much later epitomes, so drastically reduced. Just the highlights of the sort of Saxon violence, often rather garbled, often, even if he, writing in the 3rd century, may have struggled necessarily to understand all the politics of earlier, certainly the epitomators, putting it together in 7th century and later, it's much, much worse. They don't really understand the system they're describing, and you do just get some very odd stuff. None of the major historians who were around that covered the 2nd century, and some were contemporaries, none of them survive. You have Lucian of Samosata wrote this satire on how to write history about the flood of accounts of Lucius Verus's war against the Parthians, and he mocks them and occasionally quotes little bits, but we know there was lots being written. He's saying it's all trash, it's all grovelling nonsense. However, none of it survives. So we can't judge. Presumably there was a mixture, as there had always been, of some reasonably reliable, deep stuff, some more trivial, some just sloppy, in the same way you'd get in any period. But the difficulty here is that it simply doesn't survive. The literature from the 2nd century AD isn't really concerned with major political and military events and anything of that sort. So you end up with relying on things like the Historia Augusta. That's probably late 4th century, but again, many of you will probably already be familiar with this. The author presents himself as being several authors, pretends to be other people writing at various times, who wrote, continuing in the sort of Suetonius trend of writing biographies of emperors. These are far more lurid and over the top than Suetonius ever was. But they begin, you have material about Hadrian and from then on, and Marcus Aurelius and Antoninus Pius and others. We end up using them because there is nothing else very often, but they do not inspire a lot of confidence in terms of reliability, in that A, they're much later, but also the author is clearly playing literary games and having fun and then just writing any old lurid nonsense that he feels like. So we have to be careful, but that's the problem. That there simply isn't other material. Suetonius finished with Domitian, his 12 Caesars. Tacitus was a senator under Trajan, and as he had been under the Flavians and under Nerva. Suetonius actually was part of the imperial administration. He was one of these equestrians that started to find employment from Domitian onwards, in terms of, this was the case in the archives and the imperial correspondence. And that's why in his early books he has access to private letters between Augustus and Livia and things like that. The sort of detail you get in the earlier books is far greater than later on, and this is because he got sacked by Hadrian. We'll come on to that in a minute as to the possible circumstances, but there's some sort of scandal involving perhaps the emperor's wife, Sabina. We don't quite know what was going on, but he no longer has access to the imperial archives. Therefore, the quality of his last few lives declines drastically, and there is no replacement. So he's gone. But these are men who were alive. So many scholars, in the way that scholars inevitably will, though often, I think almost always unwisely, in my opinion, they've tried to look at Tacitus and Suetonius and looked for the coded messages, the coded criticism of Trajan, of Hadrian, that appears in their accounts of earlier emperors. Once you start reading between the lines like that, you will see lots of things, but whether they're really meant to be there is another matter. I think very often your imagination gets carried away, and that sort of textual criticism I've always found rather unconvincing. But it comes back to this basic problem. What we tend to get from some of the sources that are around, or things like the Historia Augusta that we're using out of desperation, are anecdotes about character rather than about policy, political decisions, about actual things that these emperors were doing. So you have a story of Trajan riding in a chariot with a philosopher by his side and saying, the idea that just to have this image of this bluff, simple soldier, I don't understand a word you're saying. He's supposed to say to this philosopher, but I love you as dearly as myself. You sound great, you impress me, I don't understand it. It's rather like this, everybody, when you saw the copies of Hawking's A Brief History of Time appearing on lots of people's shelves when they evidently hadn't actually read the book, but it's a sort of status symbol, and the way people will buy certain things and display them to suggest that they know about this sort of stuff. Another one that's probably an even better story is the one of Hadrian visiting the bathhouse in Rome, and he sees a man rubbing his back up against a wall to scratch his back. And he asks him, why are you doing that? He says, well, I can't afford a slave. So Hadrian has a slave bought and given to the man so that he has an attendant to look after him. The next time Hadrian goes to the baths, there are supposed to be rows and rows of men all up against the wall, all rubbing their backs against it, all hoping, and Hadrian's comment then is, scratch each other's backs. So you get those sorts of stories which are quite fun, but it makes it very hard to produce a narrative of the period that has any sort of conviction as to really what's going on. So we've got to be cautious. So I won't go into a lot of the controversies, a lot of the issues where we simply can't be sure. This was going to be very broad brush, and this will be, and I will try and live up to this, compared to my usual fare and compared to the rest of this series, this will be a comparatively short video, simply because there's a limit. Once you go beyond a certain point, you start to get into discussion of detail based around very limited and problematic evidence, and it really will take us too much in. Now, there are some issues we might choose to cover on other occasions, and I think at some point, because this period is very much the background of my Vindlander novels, and there's the successive series, The City of Victory, so the 6 novels about Flavius Ferox, and some of the issues that come up with those. I've always thought maybe I'll do a sort of historical commentary on what I was trying to do and how I interpret some of the sources at some point. But I know the fiction-based stuff tends to get less attention on the channel than the straightforward history, but where the two cross over, I think maybe it's interesting, because when you're writing a novel, you start thinking about things in a slightly different way to the historian, because you're looking much more at the very detailed chronology day to day and a sense of, well, what sort of impression is this creating? So we'll see. Maybe we'll get around to that at some point, but there's quite a lot on my to-do list at the moment, so we'll see how it goes. There is, however, having said all of this about the problem of the sources, there's actually a lot of literature written in this period. Again, this is the time when not just Tacitus and Suetonius, but Plutarch is writing, Appian is writing. There's vast amounts of philosophical, rhetorical work. It's just not history. You know, this is the time of the Second Sophistic, this great flourishing of Greek literature within the Roman context. And, you know, it's also the time Arrian's writing about Alexander the Great. He also wrote accounts of Roman relations with Parthia, not survived, of course. Various other bits that have gone. We know of stuff that was out there. So we have this, we have a lot of inscriptions, because again, this is a period of a lot of monumental building, and you often set up some nice little carved stone inscription to tell us what this is about, and much of this has survived. So anyway, let's keep the narrative simple and let's move on to the first of our 2 emperors, Trajan, because we won't really look at any great detail at Nerva. Trajan reigns from 98 to 117. He is away from Rome when Nerva dies. He is still in his provincial command. Although he's been adopted, he has not been recalled to Rome to do things. And what's interesting is that he stays for a good 5-6 months, first of all in his own province, and then traveling along to the Danubian provinces and visiting the armies there. He is basically waiting to see whether or not the Senate is going to accept him, whether or not there will be a challenger. So he's watching events, but he's watching them on the basis that I'm with the troops are loyal to me, I will make sure as much of the army, at least in Europe, is loyal to me as possible. So anyone who actually thinks about challenging me, you better think very hard. You better think that you're going to find some legions somewhere, because I've got a big army, and if it gets nasty. So it's not until quite late, till the autumn, late summer, autumn of 98, that he actually returns to Rome, even though he's already been emperor for half a year. That's quite interesting, and is a sign that, remember, anyone who's a senator at this time is old enough to remember the year of 4 emperors. That's still living memory. That is still a real possibility. So it's one of those moments where, yes, we tend to think of this, well, this is the start of the 5 good emperors, you know, we've just had Nerva, we're moving on to Trajan. Trajan will be remembered with immense respect and fondness as one of the great emperors, set alongside Augustus, sometimes even revered beyond Augustus, and even in that strange way, he is adopted by the Christian emperors later on as the ideal of what an emperor should be, in so many respects, in terms of his attitude to the Senate, his military prowess, his self-discipline, his character, essentially. Obviously, heavily idealized. So Trajan doesn't just rush back to Rome and everybody cheers. He waits to see, you know, anyone going to make an issue of this? Anyone got a problem with me as emperor? If so, you know, I might see what I have to do about that. But nevertheless, so there are no executions at the start of Trajan's reign. In fact, the succession does prove to be smooth, but Trajan is preparing in case that doesn't happen. So that's one of those things that's very easy to miss if you just skim through a simple chronology. But he does succeed, and he does emphasize treating the Senate with great respect, the idea, again, that he is a senator. Now, Trajan's family comes from Spain. That's where their lands are, around Italica, that area. They seem to be descended from at least in part Roman settlers, though no doubt there's been some intermarriage as well, particularly as more and more of the province got citizenship, or at least its elite. Oddly enough, although we see him as the Spanish emperor, the sources, such as they are, put more emphasis on Hadrian's foreignness, on Hadrian sort of being a bit of a hick, very provincial, speaking with a distinct accent, not sounding like a proper Roman. Trajan is not treated like that. Again, remember, a lot of his childhood has actually been in Rome, or has been in imperial service on his father's staff around the Flavian court. But unlike Hadrian, he is not renowned as a great speaker. But he does take great care to treat the Senate with respect, and this clearly works well, and it is reflected in the memory of him, the way that the tradition portrays him. It is the last period of intensive expansion of the empire, at least in terms of major aggressive wars. The first target being Dacia, and we'll probably look at Dacia in a bit more detail in one of the other lectures, and the wars between the Romans and the Dacians. And I've still got to, I know I've left sort of dangling the introductory sessions we did on the Trajan's Column and the Adam Clissi monument. I'll get back to those at some point, and we'll look at this because it's fascinating, though of course plagued by the difficulty, the lack of sources. Domitian had fought against the Dacian king Decebalus and had suffered defeats. The Roman province across the Danube, Moesia, had been raided, a governor killed, an army defeated. Cornelius Fuscus had gone off and been defeated. Again, there's the debate over whether the Adam Clissi Memorial records the names of men killed in one of these disasters, but that's only one possibility. Domitian claimed to have fought the war to a victory. He'd imposed peace on the Dacians. However, the peace terms were not, by Roman standards, particularly favourable. They didn't emphasise to everyone that Rome was superior, Dacia was inferior. So Decebalus has received subsidies. He's received Roman experts, engineers that have helped him with fortifications, with construction of siege engines. He's accused of welcoming deserters from the Roman army, recruiting them into his own forces to try and make at least part of the royal army more regular, more professional, do things the Roman way. So it is seen as unfinished business. Domitian has been mocked for his boasts about campaigns that were less successful. Now, a lot of this mockery probably becomes more open after he's dead. And there is an undercurrent in Tacitus' biography of his father-in-law Agricola, the idea that Agricola has won real glory in Britain, but those conquests have been thrown away because Domitian was making a hash of things on the Danube and his wars against the Chatti elsewhere, and has had to draw troops away so that this is occupied. But the idea that Tacitus presented is that you can be a decent man, a traditional Roman senator, even though Agricola is in fact a Gaul and by blood, and has, the family has only been in Roman aristocrats for a few generations, and this is really the peak they've reached. Nevertheless, you can behave according to the conventions of what an aristocrat expected from career, from public service. You can do that, and even under a bad emperor like Domitian, you can still be an honourable man and a good servant of the state, even if the emperor is bad. And that you don't need to do, you notice it's a theme in the annals that men who stand up to Nero and others and just get themselves executed or told to commit suicide don't achieve anything. So they make a lot of fuss and a lot of show, but what's the point? So Tacitus, who of course himself had done rather well, thank you very much, under the Flavians, his own career had progressed nicely, isn't really too keen on that. He's trying to show that you can be a good guy even under bad emperors, even if you sometimes you've got to keep quiet, but you don't have to do bad things. You sometimes don't have to complain about bad things either, but you can store it up for when the good emperors come along. Trajan fights two wars where he participates in person, the First and Second Dacian Wars, 101 to 102, and then 105 to 106. There is sometimes called the Third Dacian War a little bit later. He doesn't seem to have been present with that. They end with the utter destruction of the Dacian kingdom and a creation of a new province of Dacia. The capital will be the Colonia Sarmigetusa Ulpia. Decebalus' capital, Sarmigetusa Regia, as it's known, was up in the Carpathians in quite a difficult to reach spot. but one clearly of importance for Dacian culture, Dacian traditions, religion. Trajan creates an entirely new city and a colony of Roman citizens drawn predominantly from Danubian and eastern provinces of the empire, but from quite a wide range. There were clearly incentives offered to people to come and settle here. And it's all done very properly. There are very, very impressive ruins there today. If you ever get a chance to visit Transylvania in Romania, well worth a look. I was there in the 90s, so there wasn't much in the way of it. It was only a very small museum. Hopefully they've had a bit more invested and they've been able to improve on that, because it's a terrific site. And I helped out on a survey where we were trying to look at some of the buildings outside the city walls. You've got an amphitheatre there that, in the post-Roman period, after the Roman province of Dacia was abandoned, is turned into a sort of little mini fort by blocking up some of the things. But it's again, nicely preserved. You can see some of the system underneath. So it's one of those rather sad things. I saw one of the students playing football managed to injure his leg, I think broke his foot or his bone in his leg, and was stretchered off from that. So I have seen somebody stretchered off from a Roman amphitheatre, but not for obviously for gladiatorial purposes. The whole thing is done very traditionally. You have the ceremonial placing of the groma and then a stone to commemorate this one, the bit where you put the surveyor's tool, the groma, and the spot, and you start to lay out by centuriation the rows of streets and then the land around this. The modern village covers only a small part of it, so even where it hasn't been excavated, and there's quite a lot of that, you can see the tumps in the ground where these big rectangular buildings clearly are. It's got its temple quarter that's partially been excavated. We'll talk more about this when we look at life in the Roman provinces, because it's interesting to look at a community like this that is a creation of the 2nd century AD and flourishes for a century and a half before it's the province is abandoned. But how very Roman this is, how much there is a clear imperial culture that is pretty much the same wherever you go. There are local variations, but it's basically the same. You've also got, you can see the underground strong rooms underneath the basilica and the edge of the forum for the public offices, traces of the magistrates, of the collegia, the guilds of craftsmen, artisans. It's very interesting, and we will look at this in more detail. In some cases, I think I've still got a lot of slides that need to be scanned into digital form, because when I was there in the 90s, it was still very much, for me anyway, a question of 35mm photographs and slides. So what's harder to say is, clearly there are these settlers that are brought in and occupy this, and to some extent some of the other cities that develop. Trajan's column, in one of the very badly eroded scenes at the top, seems to show Dacian refugees leaving or being evicted from their lands. So it's been an interesting thing that I remember when I was there in the 90s, it wasn't long after the fall of communism, there were different interpretations being twisted or employed for political purposes under different regimes. So there had been a tradition of continuity with the Dacians, and it was quite odd that there was a sort of popular image of the Dacians as tall, blonde, blue-eyed, these sort of remarkably Aryan, heroic. The comparison was often samurai priests, incredibly good warriors, but also quite religious, people with great knowledge of the stars, and which again is attested. At other times, depending on whether the communists were in power or after the overthrow, there'd been more emphasis on, no, all the Dacians were thrown out, everybody was Roman, therefore we are descendants of Romans and settlers. And it shows how, again, this is not new. This was 19th century France, Napoleon III getting very keen on trying to find Alesia, excavating the siege lines there, trying to understand Caesar. The Germans promoting Arminius, Luther calling him Herman the German, as this sense of who are our ancestors, who are our past. The French school children, I don't know about today, but certainly many of my age group that I've spoken to talk about, being taught about our ancestors, the Gauls, les Gallois. It's different. Different countries will use the past in different ways, but the reality is often a lot harder to understand. We don't entirely know what happens. One big problem is, and again, maybe this has changed since then because it's not my primary field and I haven't had a chance to look at this, but the impression certainly I got then, looking around various collections, was that local pottery types didn't change much, that the same styles were in use for centuries on end, which doesn't necessarily happen elsewhere, but that makes it very hard to data cite and find out, is this from the Roman period, is this not? So a lot's going on. Trajan certainly succeeds. There is some problems, and there is a whole question of the frontier that's created in the Dacian province, exposure to some Asian groups and others, and that may be what the Third Dacian War is about. Maybe there are some still determinedly independent Dacians fighting it as well. The sources are abysmally poor, and as I've said in the talks on looking at the reliefs on Trajan's column, what's so frustrating is that here we have a clearly detailed narrative and a story of these campaigns, but we don't know what the story is because there's no captions like the Bayeux Tapestry, and we have no even moderately detailed account in the literature of what this might be representing. So that while you can see, oh yes, Romans advance, Romans clears forest, Romans build roads, Romans cross a bridge, Romans besiege town, Romans fight battle, Dacians counterattack, Dacians cross the Danube, attack Roman forts, putting it all together in any sort of detail is extraordinarily difficult. But it's all done on a big scale. You have, and you can see it in parts of the Danube, where Trajan builds this road along the river, at times setting it into the cliffs. Essentially, you have the great bridge built by Julius Apollinaris, the famous architect, that again is depicted on Trajan's column, built on a massive scale, so that this is permanently linking. We're not just going to use ferries, we are going to be able to walk and march across to our new province. So you could try and understand the wars in more detail, and maybe we will another time, but it becomes difficult because so much of the information is not simple to interpret or missing. But this is very much a success. This is Trajan the conqueror, Trajan the soldier. Again, worth emphasizing, he doesn't have a particularly strong military record before he becomes emperor. And the fact that by 101, he's only become emperor, this is 3 years on from the start of his reign, he embarks on a major campaign that clearly takes a year or more of preparation. There are detachments of troops from almost every province of the Roman Empire will serve at some point in the Dacian campaign. People from Britain, there are people from Syria, there are people from all over, from the legions in Germany, auxiliary troops brought there as well. It's possible that a significant chunk, perhaps a quarter of the Roman army, gets concentrated, or at least gets involved in the campaign at some point. It's always difficult to tell because that a unit is attested doesn't necessarily tell us how large a detachment is present or whether the unit in its main strength is there. But this is a huge effort. It does seem to be a war dominated by sieges, and you have the Murus Dacicus, the Dacian, perhaps a development, perhaps an innovation of their own, but it's even more formidable in terms of the sort of timber box structure the Caesar talks about, the Murus Gallicus. Dacia is well fortified. It's also extremely rugged country. You move through the passes of the Iron Gates, you move into the Carpathians. The Dacians have fortified it well, they defend it well with considerable determination and fight with skill, and this is the time where you see, we've talked about in the Trajan's column videos, you get depictions of Dacians employing catapults, bolt shooters. So this is not a walkover by any means, and that's apart from all the allies. Decebalus is one of those tribal leaders like Arminius and Maroboduus amongst the Cherusci and the Suebi. Like Ariovistus probably before, the charismatic leader who can unite tribal peoples into something much more coherent and unified than is normally possible. Now, most of these men are unable to pass that on to successors. In Decebalus' case, he doesn't get a chance because he gets zapped by the Romans. But nevertheless, this is not a walkover. This is a difficult campaign. Trajan is there in person. He is very prominent on Trajan's column, supervising, not depicted fighting. And that's also true on the Great Trajanic Frieze, one of the other monuments that shows him being acclaimed by his soldiers. There is a sense of fighting going on near Trajan, but Trajan is not depicted as an Alexander the Great charging around and hacking at people. It's very much the battlefield manager and witness to his men's valour that you see depicted in Caesar and in most other Roman sources. So that dominates the early part of his reign. It proves to be extraordinarily profitable because the Dacian kingdom is also rich. It's got lots of natural resources, gold in particular, so that Decebalus's power has been helped and aided by the fact that he can control this wealth to hire people to win supporters. The Romans take that over and Dacia is looted. It's interesting that you even get that depiction of the mules being loaded up with swag, basically, on Trajan's column itself. It's not necessarily the most heroic thing you'd think of representing in your celebration of the war, but here's the loot we got, lads, is there. This will pay for the construction of Trajan's Forum, which you can see today, or at least a large part of it. Centerpiece of Trajan's column, libraries involved in the complex, the marble flooring. It's very lavish, very spectacular. It's the other side of Mussolini's Rome from the Forum Romanum and the Forum of Augustus and Caesar. Again, well worth a look. It's spectacular. There's even, I can't remember what it's called, but my son on his PlayStation VR, the old PS4, the VR1, there's a sort of puzzle game that's done quite nicely where you walk around Trajan's Forum, all reconstructed, trying to find various notes and things. But it helps to give an impression. But because part of it's built into the hillside, you get some sense of the size of it all. But remember that Trajan's column was supposed to mark the height of the land that had been excavated out of that to build the thing. So this is very grand. This shows the wealth of it. This is a big boost. A lot of wars in the ancient world, there is generally a tendency to think of all warfare, all successful warfare, as profitable. That's probably nowhere near as true as scholars tend to think, but sometimes you do get a real bonanza like this. Again, doesn't mean the war hasn't been very costly, both in lives and also the material that's been consumed. Nevertheless, again, there are plenty of tombstones where soldiers record being decorated for valour under Trajan that date to the Dacian Wars or later on the Eastern expedition. Trajan likes to present himself as the simple soldier. He likes to be seen on campaign. But again, the bulk of his time on campaign is when he's already emperor. Later on, you'll have his Parthian War, which is even less well understood than the Dacian conflicts from 113 to 117. This is a major expedition that begins in Armenia. We don't really know what causes it all. Trajan confronts the local king, who clearly expects that submission will allow him to get reappointed, and in fact Trajan dismisses him, forces him to abdicate, abolishes the kingdom. You have the creation of new provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia, not as allied communities, as directly ruled, permanently garrisoned Roman provinces. Ctesiphon, the great royal city built by the Parthians to be distinct from Seleucia on the Tigris that had been built by the Seleucids, but is an important city for the Parthians and built in that different tradition. The Parthians build cities that are circular rather than the square and the grid pattern of Greek cities. But Ctesiphon is where the king of kings of the Parthians is crowned, and that tradition continues. It is the same for the Sasanian Persians. So this place is very important. But it's sacked for the first time by the Romans under Trajan. Again, very large armies are assembled for this expedition, and that implies some level of preparation. It takes time to move people around the empire, to concentrate them in these different regions, ready to go and prosecute this war, and to have the food and other resources that they need, the ability to supply them while they're doing that. One striking thing that may also be true in Dacia, but we don't know because the sources aren't so good, is that it doesn't seem to operate as one large concentrated field army, but instead you get the impression of several armies of a couple of legions plus auxiliaries operating independently or semi-independently. Now maybe it's like Napoleon's corps d'armée system, whereby the corps go off and do their things, but when necessary you can all concentrate. it does rather suggest the Parthians aren't too keen on fighting a mass battle, but you have different leaders appear. One intriguing fellow is Lucius Quietus, who's an aristocrat royal family of Mauritania, of the Moorish peoples of North Africa. First appears leading a tribal contingent of men fighting in their own ethnic way, the famous Numidian light cavalry that Hannibal had used to such great effect, and then Scipio had managed to convince enough to join him that gives him the victory at Zama. Again, depicted very prominently on Trajan's column. Lucius Quietus does remarkably well. He moves into the Roman system, becomes a senator, becomes a provincial governor. He is one of the army commanders at this time, operating independently. So he's trusted to that degree, both in terms of competence and loyalty, by Trajan. Again, he's one of those people you'd love to know more about, because it'd be interesting to know what the cultural mix was there, because he seems to have gone in one generation rather than, usually it takes several. You become Roman citizens as the aristocrats, and then eventually child, grandchild might become a senator. He does it all in one go. It starts terribly well. Trajan gets down to the Persian Gulf and is supposed to look at a ship that's setting sail for India or Sri Lanka, and then weep because he's too old to follow Alexander and go off. Now again, whether that's fantasy, any Roman commander, let alone emperor, even vaguely glances in the direction of the Parthians or Sasanian Persians, and the poets and everybody else start talking about Alexander the Great straight away. So who knows? But this is one of those campaigns that appears to go well and then starts to fall apart, because there are widespread rebellions throughout the conquered territory that seem to spring up almost simultaneously. And it might be a reflection that the Romans are spread too thin. It might be a reflection that the Romans had outstayed their welcome, that they weren't resented. Or it might be there is the school of thought that sees this as classic Parthian warfare, that you give, you give, you give, and you build up your strength to then strike the enemy once he's got worn out. And you're doing what tactically they do. Someone like Carhae, you're doing this on a strategic scale. And you could argue that they've been doing this even when they were fighting the Seleucids back in the 2nd century BC. So it might be that some of this is coordinated and premeditated. Whether or not that extends to the large-scale Jewish rebellion that occurs of the Jewish populations, particularly in Egypt, but also in Cyprus, in Cyrenaica, in North Africa, not significantly to any great degree in Judea or Galilee itself. They seem to remain largely peaceful, in part because at one point Lucius Quietus is sent there, and he is remembered as a particularly stern and repressive governor in some of the Talmudic stuff. Not many mentions, but he is there. So the initial success turns sour. There are rebellions. Rebellions require lots and lots of troops to suppress, and the Romans are probably don't have enough. They can't be everywhere at the same time. On the other hand, the impression is that they do manage to defeat most of the main rebel forces that appear, or the returning Parthian army. Trajan names one member of the Parthian royal family as King of Kings, as a sort of client-allied ruler. This chap doesn't last very long, but there's an attempt to sort of, whether it's putting a good spin on what's happened or an attempt to make a political solution that will actually give a lasting peace, to create a friendly Parthian monarch that will make sure that Rome's frontier is properly protected. Remember, Rome's frontier has still advanced considerably. The problem is that we don't know, as I've said, why the war is fought in the first place. What's the provocation? To what extent does Trajan, what's he think he's doing, and therefore what's the objective? What was the end game? It seems unlikely that conquest of the entire Parthian Empire was ever planned, because that is a vast area and the Romans have a reasonable idea of just how vast that is. And there's no obvious attempt to do that even before the rebellions come through. So this is a show of force, an attempt to show your domination, but quite what was planned. And of course, during the course of a war, the objectives may change. As you're thinking, oh yeah, hey, this is going really good, let's push our luck as far as we can, see what we can do, or actually this is all we need to do, let's pull out what's possible, what isn't. Trajan gets involved in the siege of Hatra, center of an independent, well, semi-independent, but part of the sort of extension. Remember, the Parthian great king is King of Kings, so one of the lesser kingdoms within the Parthian Empire. He takes personal charge, but he fails to take the city. There's a story of him wrecking the town walls and nearly being shot by an archer on the walls because his grey hair stands out. He's just older than the men around him. So even though he wasn't in any ornate uniform, one of the troopers, one of the singulares, his bodyguards riding next to him, is killed. That fails, and the whole thing, there is a sense that just momentum has gone from this Roman operation. And Trajan begins the journey back to Rome, seems to have given up on more conquest, so has cut his losses to some extent. However, he does still seem to be planning to keep the new provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia. So others further on may have been abandoned. We don't quite know to what extent these were planned or actually at some, in the process of being created. And Trajan is on his way back when he dies, but he dies before a very clear indication can be given of just what his plans were. One thing Trajan has not done during his reign, he's now a man well into middle-aged, he's starting to be old, he has not named a successor. Hadrian is his relative, a cousin, but everything suggests that Trajan just didn't like him. They don't get on. He has not shown excessive favour. Yes, he gets a good marriage, again within the extended imperial family, but he gets some jobs. But when the Eastern War begins, whereas he does, probably the bearded figure who appears on Trajan's column is Hadrian, the bearded army commander. He's commanded a legion at that time. He's had a provincial command. He's actually in Athens when the war begins for part of the time. And a senator needed permission to leave Italy to go anywhere like that. So he's clearly gone with permission, but he doesn't seem to be on any sort of official task. He is not favoured. He is not marked out. Now, this might be because Trajan didn't like him. This might be because Trajan planned to let the Senate decide, as they decided to choose Nerva when Domitian had died. It might even be, this is perhaps more the novelist in me starting to speculate, but you do have to wonder if one of the reasons for the whole expedition, if this is a man well into middle age, starting to feel old age coming on, who has been very active, has enjoyed the military command he's been able to do as emperor. He served quite a lot with the army before, but not necessarily during actual campaigning, but now he's done that, rather enjoyed it. It's a lot simpler, perhaps something that's rather more pleasant, more congenial than day-to-day being polite to senators, listening to boring petitions, flattering senators, and going about the business of making decisions, dispensing justice and rulings as emperors have to do. Is this perhaps a man who is still not wanting to face up to older age, that doesn't want to admit I might die, which the appointment of a successor clearly implies, I'm not going to be here forever, and falls back into, let's go to war again. That was simple. I liked that. That was simple. That was satisfying. That was successful. Doesn't quite go as well as that in the Eastern campaigns, though it's not an unmitigated disaster either. But it is probably a case where you've overstretched, and the Parthians don't give up easily. They might seem to be beaten, but they'll come back at you. And politically, trying to appoint a Parthian ruler has always been problematic, doesn't tend to work, because the Parthians kill each other, at least the royal family does, with great enthusiasm, just as Roman senators will do that at various times. So Trajan dies on the journey back. It is then announced, the sources suggest, remember the sources are not good, that his widow, Plotina, has, she's the one who makes the announcement happen, but claims that in his dying moments or in his last hours, Trajan finally adopts Hadrian as his son and therefore by implication makes him his nominated successor. She declares that, she goes on record as saying that, and Hadrian acts upon it immediately. He's not necessarily present when Trajan actually dies, but he gets there soon and then starts to send out orders and instructions as emperor. So there are rumours that this has all been faked, that Trajan has already died when Hadrian arrives, so that there's no adoption. There's also, intriguingly, the tombstone of Trajan's senior chamberlain or butler has survived. And this chap died within a matter of days of the emperor dying. So he was only 28, so perhaps he was ill as well, but you have to wonder, is this covering something up? Again, the novelist in me is much readier to go down that route, but it's certainly a possibility. Hadrian becomes emperor, though, and acts very quickly. He is supported by the Praetorian Guard and its commanders at Rome, and there are arrests made. Senior senators who are under suspicion of not being likely to back Hadrian, or who have given any indication at all that they're not going to, are very quickly arrested. One of them is Lucius Quietus, by this time governor of Judea. He is removed from office, arrested, and either is forced to commit suicide or is executed very quickly. Hadrian's reign begins with the death of several senators, and this will forever damn him in the tradition, the senatorial record. But the key thing to remember is that he is clearly not secure politically. Trajan has not done, if he did want Hadrian to be his successor, he's not made that at all clear. And he's not made Hadrian's route to power at all easy. So that Hadrian has to be looking over his shoulder and wondering whether there's going to be a plot against him, because he doesn't have that security that Trajan had as Nerva's clear successor. And remember, as we said before, Trajan still stays with the army for a long time, keeping the troops handy, making sure they're loyal, just to make sure nobody gets any bright ideas about alternatives. So Hadrian is insecure. He can't risk renewing the Eastern War and spending years off on campaign winning glory. That's if it was even practical. It might be that the army, in terms of its supply system, is simply exhausted and its manpower, and isn't really in a good place to do that. Perhaps he also believed that Trajan had bitten off more than he could chew, that the empire wasn't ready for this level of expansion so quickly after adding Dacia, adding requirement for more legions as permanent garrison. So Mesopotamia and most of the other eastern provinces are abandoned. Armenia will go. There is a bit more territory. The Roman province's border is a bit further forward than it had been, but it's still the border of the provinces of Syria, or the province of Syria, rather than a new province of Mesopotamia. We left for Septimius Severus nearly a century later to go back and, well, not quite a century, create Mesopotamia as a permanent province. Hadrian will spend much of his reign traveling around the empire. And part of that, when he's doing this, he always is doing what emperors do. He's holding court, holding assizes, acting as a sort of super imperial governor, sort of things we were talking about with Cicero, and particularly Pliny, listening to petitions, dispensing justice, making decisions, rulings on things. But he also spends an awful lot of time visiting the army. It may be no coincidence that you get quite a lot of inscriptions around this time to the cult of disciplina, of discipline within the army. We have that marvelous collection of inscriptions, partly fragmentary, but quite a lot survive, from Lambysis in North Africa, where he watches the provincial army, Legio III Augusta and auxiliaries, going through maneuvers on exercise, and then gives them these pep talks at the end of it. Again, we will come back to these many, many times, I'm sure. So that you feel there's an element of, this is a man who's trying to make sure everybody knows that he's the emperor, they're his troops, they should be loyal to him, watching for any potential threat, and trying to get the empire working again, consolidate what he's got, trying to make the provinces well governed. So there is criticism of the abandonment of his conquest by some senators, including Dio Cassius, who is equally critical of Septimius Severus when he creates his perhaps larger province of Mesopotamia later on, and isn't convinced the idea this is what Severus claims a bulwark to the emperor. Hadrian is a little bit different, though, in his style. In the first place, he is an intelligent, capable man with an unfortunate personality. He is too clever by half, would be the old-fashioned British way of doing it. He likes to parade his cleverness. He likes to have the last word. He loves to be right. And we will all have met people like this, and they can be very good at their job, but they do rub people up the wrong way. So whereas Trajan didn't need to do this and almost presented a public image of someone who was, a decent enough chap, but not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He didn't need to parade his cleverness. Hadrian does, and Hadrian, he likes to design architectural projects, and Apollodorus, the man who's done all sorts of things, including the bridge across the Danube, he will eventually be bumped off by the emperor, executed for one too many criticism. When Hadrian talks about designing a temple and putting these huge statues of seated gods inside, and Apollodorus says, well, yeah, but okay, what if they stood up? They'd go through the roof. So your scale's wrong. But of course, it's under Hadrian that we get the Pantheon that you can go in Rome today and is so magnificent. That's his design. He liked his domes. He was big on domes, big on pumpkins, as his critics said. Again, tactfully, the original inscription that this building's been constructed by Agrippa is reinstalled in the Hadrianic rebuilding, and there is a debate over how much the design was changed, how much this was a renewal of what was already there. But it is one of those incredible things when you walk into that, later on a church, now just a museum, you go in and you look up at that Roman roof that's 19 centuries old and still looks so impressive. It's why so many people are often drawn to classical architecture and Roman architecture when they want to design the magnificent, the over-the-top, whether it's Hitler with all his crazed projects for this vast megacity, but also it's there in the Star Wars universe. Look at Naboo and places like that, and some of these this sense of, it does convey, because they were very good at architecture that showed off just how big you could make something, how grand you could make something, how therefore small you were in comparison to this. So Hadrian is not a man to win someone over with a joke in the way that Augustus could do. He doesn't have that magic touch, that personality. You have, again, the story about Hadrian where he corrects a philosopher, and afterwards, somebody says to him, well, to the philosopher, well, didn't you know he was wrong? Hadrian was wrong. And he says, yeah, I know that, but you don't argue with someone who controls 30 legions. That idea. We have this very flattering portrayal of Hadrian. We have this image of him as a very decent man, a good emperor. He probably was a good emperor, but he wasn't a good politician. And you can see them today, these people who've got quite high in public life, but they have this knack for saying the wrong thing and rubbing people's backs up. And the others who have that charm and who get away with rather more. He's also, of course, famously Philhellenic. This is the first bearded Roman emperor, with the exception of, well, he's not emperor at that point, but the young Augustus, when he's still avenging Julius Caesar, is depicted on coins, long shaggy hair and unshaven, bearded, because he wasn't going to shave or cut his hair until he'd avenged Caesar. But basically speaking, everyone's been a proper clean-shaven Roman up to this point. It's those funny Greeks that have beards. Curiously enough, again, we've talked about this in the Trajan's Column videos, most of the legionaries in particular that are bareheaded on Trajan's Column, an awful lot of them are depicted as bearded. So there's been a trend within the army towards this, and it's reflected on some other monuments as well, but not for an emperor. But of course, as soon as the emperor does it, and he'll be followed by successive emperors through, including Marcus Aurelius, a Greek-style philosopher's beard becomes a very popular look, in the same way that people throughout the empire, women have copied the fashions, the hairstyles of members of the imperial family based on what they're seeing on the statues and the paintings around there, and they become trendsetters. Hadrian does this. There's criticism, again, some of the sources reflect this idea that, well, he only liked a beard because he had really bad skin and he wanted to cover it up. But he shows this fondness for Greek philosophy, for Greek language, Greek ideals, partly because this is seen as a way of showing the emperor as benevolent. The philosophers have been talking about the ideal king, the ideal monarch for a very long time, that the man who is supreme in terms of power can actually be a force for good, for the wider good, for everybody. He can rule well and with benevolence. Hadrian will go to Athens, he'll lavish money on Athens, build lots of monuments there. Quite a lot of what you see is Hadrianic today, but he'll set up this rather, in this case, rather tactless inscription on an arch of, this is not the city of Theseus, this is the city of Hadrian. It's, again, perhaps if the senators didn't start off not liking Hadrian very much, he might have got away with this, but it's all seen as a bit of excessive. But I mean, you get that sense of someone who is intrigued by the wider world. If you go to Hadrian's villa at Tivoli today, and you will see the sections that are built to be a sort of representation of the Nile and of Egypt, of other parts of the world, architectural styles from all over. It's bringing the world to the emperor's private estate, you know, his resting place, but doing it in this staggeringly monumental way. So it's a big deal. He's invested a lot of money into this and wants to be surrounded by this. So it is a little bit showing off by traditional Roman standards. One of the other big things is the affair with the youth Antinous. This is a lad he's supposed to see exercising in a gymnasium as part of the ephibeia, the sort of the youth, final part of your education as a teenager for mostly aristocratic boys in Greek cities. And he has this affair with him. Now, again, it's one of those sort of slightly hypocritical things about Roman society and Roman attitudes to sexuality. There are stories that Trajan was too fond of boys. Probably that's to be interpreted as, you know, wanting to have sex with young male lovers. Again, which great, you know, something the Greek aristocracy, or at least the Athenian aristocracy, has been celebrating for a very long time. But they're not named, and there are no images of them. And it's all considered to be discreet. In the main, and you see this from the Republic onwards, Roman aristocrat was allowed to do pretty much what he liked, as long as he didn't show off about it, as long as it wasn't public, as long as it was discreet, as long as everyone could pretend he was just a normal, restrained heterosexual male who had a wife, maybe had a few affairs with women, but didn't get too worked up about. You know, the sign of being too devoted to sex was a sign of effeminacy, a sign of weakness. Is this Roman attitude? Again, maybe we'll talk about some of this stuff another time. So Trajan, of course, has not had any children. That doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have sex with his wife or anyone, but it's there in the way that Hadrian will not have any children of his own. There is one story that he and his wife Sabina clearly do not get on. You know, she's been useful, she's part of the imperial family, so a closer relationship with Plotina, Trajan's wife, that helps Hadrian to succeed. There are stories that Hadrian, rather like Augustus and others, was accused of sleeping with senators' wives to find out what their husbands were doing. So there are stories about him having affairs with women as well, but the marriage clearly it was not a close one, not a happy one. And Sabina becomes marginalized fairly early on. There's the story that she took precautions to make sure she could never become pregnant by Hadrian. Whether that's true or not, who knows, it might simply be gossip. In the Historia Augusta, the story of her disgrace follows on from Hadrian's visit to Britain, and it's when the Praetorian prefect gets dismissed, as does Suetonius, the biographer, from his job. So there might have been some scandal going on around the empress, but we don't really know what it was. But Hadrian parades Antinous around as his lover, and that's going too far. You know, you could, if it was, you know, he was having this affair on the side and we could just pretend it wasn't happening, that would be fine. But when you were setting up statues of this boy everywhere, then that's just simply not on. This is not what a Roman emperor should be doing publicly. You know, keep quiet about it. Do what you like, but don't tell us about it. You know, was it don't ask, don't tell type thing of a few years back. Then Antinous dies during Hadrian's visit to Egypt, drowns in the Nile, rumours of sacrificing himself for his lover to live a longer, more prosperous life. Something very weird, and Hadrian's grief is excessive. Antinous is even deified in some of the provinces of the Greek East. And again, you know, there are lots of images, though sometimes, as with all, you know, it might just be that a bust we've identified as bust of Antinous is just a bust of a youth. And there's always the tendency you want anyone you find, any statue or bust or image, to be that of somebody famous. And I remember there was a British Museum exhibition on Hadrian a few years back where some of them you were looking at and thinking, yeah, I'm not sure. I think this is it's possible, but it's unlikely. But you have that. It's not tactful. This is not how the Roman aristocracy feels a Roman emperor should behave in public. So Hadrian gets people's backs up, annoys them, breaks convention, and as a result leaves an ambiguous reputation. There is a lot of criticism. He is not remembered so fondly as one of the great and good emperors. And yet, again, things in the provinces work reasonably well. Most famously, of course, particularly if you're British, he comes to Britain and builds Hadrian's Wall. We'll talk about that in more detail, perhaps even in the next session of this. And I might combine that. I've been wanting to do some more Hadrian's Wall stuff for a while. But one or another, we'll do something like that. There presumably have been problems in Britain to cause this. And although the details are not clear, there may have been a big war, a big rebellion, or a big incursion from tribes to the north into the Roman province in the last years of Trajan's reign. So again, a reflection. It might be that there really is overstretch because you've taken detachments of troops to involve first in Dacia and then more importantly in the eastern campaign and sent them to the opposite end of the empire. Elsewhere, provinces are in trouble and there aren't the garrisons. They're perceived as weak, and perhaps that's exploited by ambitious local leaders, or the Romans have stirred up trouble when they haven't really got the force to back up their rule. There may be more fighting during the building of Hadrian's Wall. Again, that's something we can come to another time. The big rebellion, the one that's greatly remembered, is the rebellion in Judea from 131 to 135, led by the man who becomes dubbed Bar Kokhba, a messianic leader in some shape or form. It seems to be prompted, the final straw is that Hadrian decides to build a temple to Jupiter on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has already become a Roman garrison, and 10th Legion has been based there, and a fortress, a base for them, has been built on that part of the city, on the site of the old temple. But once you turn this into a temple to a foreign Roman deity, then it's a very clear message that people might have been able to think for a generation or two, well, maybe we'll get it restored. Maybe the emperor will relent and we can rebuild the center of our faith. This prompts a rebellion. There are probably other reasons causing it as well. There's one sort of slightly odd tradition in some of the rabbinic sources that has it provoked when some Roman troops are going through a village and they steal and kill some chickens. And a group of brothers go out and duff them up, and this sort of escalates into a war. But that seems to be the main provocation from Hadrian. It is defeated after several years of intensive fighting. Just as in the rebellion against Nero, the rebels are able to create their own independent regime for several years, and they start minting coins. Interestingly enough, the Romans are, according to Dio, reluctant to risk battle with the rebels, and instead this is a war of sieges, which of course had broadly been true of the earlier campaign as well, where they take over, I think he talks about over 900 villages. Walled strongholds, walled villages, small towns, small cities are taken by siege. There's talk of rebels using tunnel systems that, has a whole sort of Vietnam vibe about it all, where they are able to come out and surprise the Romans. And there is some archaeological trace of this. And of course you have caves and other sites that seem to be associated with rebels. There's the famous helmet that's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, that looks very much like the ones depicted on Trajan's column. That's probably associated with loot taken from the Romans at this point, or equipment used against its previous owners. Hadrian sends good commanders to the spot. They're given the resources and they systematically suppress the rebels. There's something interesting in that you have this big rebellion in Judea now when Judea hadn't joined in the earlier rebellion. And of course, the same thing is true. There aren't big rebellions of the Jewish population elsewhere to tie in with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, partly because they've suffered so badly and the punishment has been so extreme after the earlier rebellion under Trajan. But there's that basic problem that if you're a province and you're effectively surrounded by Roman territory, then the odds are the Romans aren't going to go away. They are going to come and they will suppress you and they will defeat you in the end. And that's what happens. It's a brutal conflict. Hadrian is often, when he's mentioned in later Talmudic sources, you have this imprecation, may his bones rot. The legacy, the hatred of Hadrian lasts far longer than, say, dislike of Vespasian or Titus. This is much, much stronger and is remembered. But Jerusalem is rebuilt at the end as a very clear pagan city with a temple of Jupiter on Temple Mount, and it will remain so. Talk of expelling all the Jewish population from the city, from the area, is grossly exaggerated. Again, that's something we can talk about maybe another time. So Hadrian's reign does see major fighting in Britain, it does see major fighting in Judea, probably elsewhere as well, but there aren't the big aggressive wars of conquest that you've had under Trajan. It is more a period of consolidation, and that sense, again, we'll talk about this more next time, of Hadrian's Wall, of emphasizing how permanent the frontiers will be when you build something like Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian has groomed Verus as successor. He dies, he ends up, Antoninus Pius is adopted. When Hadrian finally dies, he's supposed to be able to predict the day and the hour of his death because he was a very keen astrologer. Again, he's retired, he's lived in Tivoli, in this area. You have there as well the inscription where one of his hunting horses dies and he composes a little poem. There's another little poem he writes about his soul as this sort of wandering creature that will soon depart. It's curious stuff, but this is again somebody who is clearly very bright and wants to express that and show that off, but not necessarily in tune with all those around him. When he dies, the tradition later, again, we're talking in Historia Augusta country, so how reliable this is, that the Senate does not want to deify him, that they're even, they're sort of moving towards damnatio memoriae, but they certainly don't want to deify him, and that it's Antoninus Pius who insists that they do, the adopted son, the heir, and that's part of the reason supposedly for the nickname Pius, but there might be other reasons for that as well. So Hadrian, on the whole, has ruled as a good emperor. He's a little bit like Domitian, not as extreme, but he is a capable administrator who is trying to do a good job, and the empire works pretty well under him. But he is disliked, strongly loathed even by large sections of the Senate, and that is reflected in the historical tradition about him. In part, it comes back to the same thing. Domitian executed senators, Hadrian executes senators, really only at the start of his reign. It doesn't keep happening. But that memory is there, that he hasn't treated us with appropriate respect, instead he's killed us, and therefore this is a man we resent. It's all made worse by the fact that Hadrian does just annoy people. He does rub them up the wrong way. But again, the succession is peaceful. Antoninus Pius will never leave Italy during his reign. So you have the direct contrast, we'll look at this more in a future session, between Hadrian the Traveller and Antoninus Pius, the stay-at-home, the man who never goes to war and appears to have no military record whatsoever. I mean, if he served with the Roman army at all, it was for very limited periods, and yet his rule is secure, he is not challenged by anyone, he is considered another good, successful emperor. So we've had a look at Trajan and Hadrian today. We'll finish at this point because, again, as I say, there's lots of detail, there are lots of aspects we could go into, but for the sake of time, let's try to keep this a bit simpler as an overview. We'll come back to some of this in some of the thematic talks and no doubt in other videos as well. But anyway, that's a look at Trajan and Hadrian and their reigns. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.